As Rebecca mentions, we've already had quite a few kind of workshops, so it's kind of both exciting and a little bit nerve-wracking to be presenting this one, but it's really exciting, as Rebecca mentions, to be collaborating with Clara on this workshop. So I sort of at various times talked about the group BP or not BP and creative activism in that way, but I think with this we really wanted to explore and look at that relationship between worker struggles, trade union movements, and some of the work we did within BP or not BP and the wider Art Not Oil movement, and to get into some of those questions. So just to give you, and I'll sort of introduce myself a little bit when I introduce BP or not BP in the group, and then Clara will sort of introduce herself through talking about her experience and her work, and we'll sort of alternate between us. So just some general things about the session today is that these kind of questions around solidarity between what we do within climate activism and within union and worker struggles, there are all kinds of like challenges around this, and it's not necessarily been something that comes naturally or easily, and there are pitfalls, there are blind spots, but there are also real strengths in working together. So it's hopefully going to be a bit of a space for us reflecting on some of the things that we've done in the past, but also for us to all bring our kind of experiences and perspectives onto that a little bit as well. So that opportunity to explore what works and what hasn't. And then specifically, we're thinking about creative tools, tactics, techniques, and what is the role that art and creativity can play, both as a tool in protest and activism, but also how is it a means for like building these relationships, these solidarity relationships, and what does it specifically offer us in those situations as well. So that's just a little bit of context. And then just so you know, when you join a thing and you're like, how long is this going to last? So we've got 2 hours set aside, but in that time, Clara and I are going to present for around 40 minutes and hopefully like fill your brains with some interesting stuff, we hope. Then we've got some space for any questions that you've got or any discussion or things you might want to kind of take issue with. And then we have got a break planned, so a little comfort break. And then when we come back, we're quite excited. We conducted a couple of interviews with people who were directly involved in some of the things we're going to talk about. So it's an opportunity to hear their perspectives. And that will be our kind of jumping off point for some breakout groups and some kind of discussions where maybe we can get into a little bit more detail and a little bit more depth about our own experiences and so on. So hopefully that all sounds good, and that just gives you a sense of what we're going to do and where we're going to go. That's probably enough kind of practical talking. So I'm going to share my screen and share some slides. Cool. So yeah, today talking about creative solidarity and how we build an alliance of workers and climate activists. And as Rebecca mentioned, I'm from the group BP or not BP originally, and have then had other experiences in and around the campaign against fossil fuel sponsorship of museums, art galleries, and cultural institutions. And so that's kind of the lens that we're going to look at this question today. So this is just very briefly, if you've not come into contact with this campaign, and it does exist in other countries as well. I guess this is a kind of UK focus, but this just shows you how fossil fuel companies sponsor art and cultural activity in order to do two things. One, to normalize their brands, make themselves look like responsible corporate citizens when, as many of us here will know, they are investing in the new fossil fuels that are pushing us much deeper into climate crisis. So inserting their name into art making and cultural activity is a way of kind of displacing that in our minds, deflecting that attention, and building what they call their social license to operate. The other thing, which is relevant to some of the places we'll talk about, places like the British Museum or the National Gallery, when you have exhibition openings or private events, this is often where these companies will invite government ministers along to have drinks and private kind of VIP meals and this kind of thing. So it's a really effective space for lobbying, and culture becomes the backdrop for that kind of lobbying activity as well. And it's also much easier to have these kind of conversations with government ministers when no one's writing anything down or keeping minutes, and you're having that conversation over a glass of wine. So that's just as a little bit of context. BP or not BP, and this is a very whistle-stop tour, so the group has been around for over 10 years now. It began its life in 2012 when BP was the sponsor of the World Shakespeare Festival at the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company, and we used to do what we called stage invasions. We'd jump up on stage and perform Shakespearean kind of sketches that would call out and challenge BP's sponsorship. And along the way, sometimes actors and the performances would come on stage and support us and intervene. So yeah, lots more could be said about that. We kind of evolved, moved on to other cultural institutions like the British Museum, and as we grew and people knew who we were, we started exploring other techniques, bringing in other skills, so doing more flash mob type protests, using quite ambitious props. As you can see here, a giant sea monster, really using kind of cultural spaces in a participatory kind of creative protest way. So this just gives you a flavor. And then as this evolved, we basically got carried away and a little too ambitious, and we thought, why don't we create a giant Trojan horse? This was back in 2020. And then the kind of peak of this kind of creative approaches was doing a 3-day occupation of the British Museum that involved working in partnership with impacted groups, working alongside impacted communities, poets, artists, different kind of climate activist movements, and staying in the Great Court and creating an artwork overnight. So we really tried to sandwich all of the kind of artistic techniques into 3 days and got terribly burnt out in the process. That's a whistle-stop tour of the group. And we've sort of, like I say, targeted various cultural institutions at different points in time. And I think at this point, I'll hand over to Clara to say a little bit about her connection to this campaign and the PCS Culture Group.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, the PCS Culture Group basically was a section of the PCS Union, which is the Public and Commercial Service Union, which represents civil servants and workers in contracted public ministry services. It's got about 100,000 members across the country in many government departments, such as more traditionally the DWP, Department for Work and Pension, HMRC, Our Majesty Revenue and Custom, Ministry of Justice, and all those government departments. We also represented workers in national museum and galleries because we came under the DCMS, Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And so represented workers in those institutions like Historic England, the British Library, but also about 4,000 museum workers and cultural workers across over 30 institutions. So the most renowned would be the British Museum, the National Gallery, the Tate, National Portrait Gallery, but also outside London, National Museums Liverpool, National Museums of Scotland and Wales. And myself, I was a union rep for about 15 years at National Museums Liverpool, also serving different roles as a branch secretary of the union there. I was also a green rep looking at climate issues in the workplace for a number of years. And I ended up spending 8 years as the president of this PCS Culture Group, representing museum workers. I met BP or not BP at an anti-fracking camp back in 2013, I think it was. They were doing a workshop about some of their anti-oil sponsorship activities. And I just turned around and said, is that you coming to our workplaces, but you're not speaking to us? And that was the start of a great collaboration. And if you want to put the next slide, Chris, I just wanted to highlight the sort of very difficult environment that museum workers were facing. We saw an increased commercialization of our museum and galleries over the years. From 2010, the politics of austerities by the Tory government meant that museums' budgets were cut by up to 30%, and it will continue to happen over the years. So the roles of our shops, cafes, but also donations and other commercial activities for our budgets were increasing. There were some disparities because institutions like Tate raised 75% of their budget through their commercial activities, whereas in Liverpool, it was less than 10%. Those museums were and still are run by boards of trustees. And they are often rich and powerful people, although you find the odd artists. But it's people like George Osborne at the British Museum, Anna Rothschild and Mark Getty at the National Gallery, from very powerful, rich, wealthy families. But also the like of Lord Brown at Tate, who used to be the CEO of BP. That's the type of people that were our bosses. And while the rich and powerful enjoyed champagne and canapes in our galleries, workers' reality was low pay. We were attacked, our terms and conditions were attacked. For example, if we were getting extra pay at weekend or for shift work, those were being deleted. There were a number of big strikes in Wales and Scotland on those issues. There was a lot of outsourcing of cafes and restaurants, either to internal trading companies, but also to external companies like Starbucks or Benugo. Often part of our visitor services and security were outsourced, like at the Tate, the British Museum, National Gallery, the Victoria and Albert Museum. And a lot of those museums were also using agencies and or 0 hours contracts. So really this commercialization of our cultural institutions means that we were seeing the growing presence of private companies that included sponsorships. And often the oil sponsorships were actually quite small amount of money, but it was also about politics and power, using our museums to greenwash or pinkwash or clean corporate reputation to make us believe they care about access to culture. In fact, many of our museums were founded on empire and the theft of artifacts from communities across the world. The lack of diversity of artists represented in our galleries, but also in the visitors and staffing, again, a lack of diversity. Privatization and oil sponsorship were two sides of the same coin, and that became one of our slogans during the biggest strike our sector ever saw, the National Gallery privatization, over 100 days of strike. And if you want to move on to the next slide, Chris. So what was happening briefly? There was a plan back in 2014-15 to privatize 400 gallery staff at National Gallery. It was the biggest privatization so far we've seen in any of our museums. The union organized resistance. We balloted members for strike action. We started to protest outside the building, and we started our strikes. Just at this time, at the very beginning of the strike, one of our lead union reps was sacked just as we started. That got people really angry, and a real battle commenced. We were the first strike to use mass online petitions. We got 150,000 people supporting us on this petition. We were using extensively social media. We had a Facebook page, over 6,000 followers. We were using Twitter, and that was quite new at the time to do so. We documented our pickets and our campaign activities. We fundraised over £150,000 for strike pay and our campaign. Our reps traveled all over the country to get support, building alliance with all sorts of groups. As I said, a total of over 100 days of strike was carried out. On our picket line, we saw a lot of creativity and different groups coming to support us. We'll see a little bit more in a minute. But we got the support from BP or Not BP, Art Not Oil, Shell Out Sound. In the middle of the strike, the National Gallery was due to open a Rembrandt exhibition sponsored by Shell and was planning to hire private security staff even before the privatization had gone through. It was union busting and collaboration with an oil company. And Chris, if you want to put the next slide, and I think you're going to tell us a little bit more about this Rembrandt exhibition.
Sure. So as Clara mentioned, it had come to our attention as BP or not BP about the Shell sponsorship of this Rembrandt exhibition of Rembrandt's late works. And as Clara mentioned, I was also part of this group called Shell Out Sounds, which was a kind of activist choir. And we'd sort of concluded a bit of campaigning. So we actually joined forces with BP or not BP and brought music into some of our actions. So actually I'm gonna just ping back. So this image on the left that you can see is of the action that we did. And I'll show the film of that action. Maybe I should the film of that action first, and then I'll speak to the two images here. But maybe just to set it up and give a bit of context is when we as a group were sort of thinking through how can we join the dots between these two issues. It was again going back to what Clara said about sponsorship and privatization being two sides of the same coin. We took the Faustus story, and so the story of someone selling their soul to the devil effectively, and kind of in much the way that we would create these like stage invasion performances where you take Shakespeare's characters and kind of map them onto the kind of real life characters playing out within these campaigns. So as you will see, the kind of gallery director became the kind of Faustus character who's selling his soul to these corporate interests. But we always like to offer them a kind of opportunity for redemption, I guess, within these stories as well.
In London town, our story starts. My gallery of national art, funded by the public, visitors they love kids. Then one day, a man from Shell came to town to cast a spell. A gallery of art wash to benefit the oil cause. See the oil spill, breathe the gas flare, taste the tar sands, the deeds of Shell.
Museum man was keen to please. He sold his soul upon his knees. His workers wanted more pay. The devils they would not play. Museum man, he bought their plan to sell his stuff to private hands. Make deals with corporate monsters like Shell, the oily sponsor.
See the oil spill, breathe the gas flare, taste the tar sands, the deeds of Shell. Museum man awoke one night, drenched in oil and nasty fright. He saw the world was changing, the climate rearranging. The man from Shell, he laughed and said,
Our profits are growing, the earth is dead.
Ah, he dreamed of oil. The delta had been spoiled. See the oil spill, breathe the gas flare, taste the tar sands, the deeds of Shell.
Museum man, he cast them out.
Corporate thieves, I have no doubt. Their name is Dungeon Oil Slick. Art is for the public.
We'll cut the cuts to national art. Culture, oil, price them apart. We'll stand for jobs and climate. Art funded by the public.
See the oil spill, breathe the gas flare, taste the tar sands, the deeds of Shell.
Hopefully, I always cringe because I see myself several years ago and involvement in that activism. But you can see how some of these groups have kind of evolved their approach. But this, at least for our group, was one of the, a first in lots of respects in terms of involving music and song in what we were doing, but also this attempt to join the dots between different issues. And one of the other things you can kind of hear there more than you can see is the private security that Clara referred to, who were actually very aggressive. But from a kind of tactical point of view, our kind of constant singing in response was a way of us sort of evading that confrontation that they really wanted to have. And I've never felt so confronted by someone's chest before, because that was the main means that security used to try and remove us from the building, was really using their physical presence, but we just kept singing and kept singing. But the really important thing was this was a point of contact between us and workers and the PCS union, and that led to us, as Clara mentioned, attending some of the strikes. But then was it this, and I realized there were lots of connections around this. In 2015, the Reclaim the Power Camp. So this is a group that organized primarily around anti-fracking, but also against fossil fuels in general, had their camp in Didcot, where there was a old sort of power station there, which was actually where I and BP or not BP met Rebecca, but also came into contact with Clara. So lots of things happened. But it was suggested off the back of this kind of ongoing campaigning and ongoing worker struggles at the National Gallery, that one of the self-organized actions should be to go to the National Gallery. But again, because we sort of instigated it and because Clara had sort of connected with us as well, it was like, okay, let's not just go in there and talk about Shell sponsorship. Let's address the fact that Candy had been sort of sacked from the gallery and that we wanted her reinstated. So you can see on the left, the kind of action which involved this kind of fake tour next to the sunflowers, which has become infamous for other reasons more recently, but then making sure that the banners and the messaging that we had was directly addressing the kind of aspects of the worker struggle as well. I'll hand back over to Clara.
Thanks, Chris. And just before we move on, really, oh yeah, Shell has ended the sponsorship, by the way, which is great. But I just want to say that most of our staff obviously were on strike and out on picket lines. So a lot of the staff operating on some of these images were, either private security hired for the purpose of breaking our strike, or some hired managers, and there were like a very small number of people who were on striking. But at the time, we weren't especially trying to stop all visitors to go in because it was impossible given the numbers. So those interventions were outside groups intervene inside the museum while we were striking, was made with our consent and with our full support, and allowed actually to interact very well with visitors and highlight our play. So we were really grateful. And this type of artistic intervention inspired us as workers to use some of the creative tactics as part of our campaigns. We had sort of like trial day a little bit, and we had Christmas Carol at the British Library, and we had done, an art auction to raise money for our union. But this started to really blow out. So we were doing banner making workshops on picket line. We started to use this sunflower. As you can see on this picture, they became like the symbol of our struggle. We were running regular like sort of art and craft sessions with the strikers in different spaces, but also on the picket line. This has just a couple of other examples. Our creativity expressed itself. We ran 2 workers' art exhibitions where people produce mainly like visual art. That was, inspired by the strike, by the frustration that they were getting, by the sort of like idea of power relationships. And we did display that at our union headquarters, inviting all the people who had supported our strike. Also, our picket lines were really creative. we got a lot of support by artists, and some of them were expressing it on social media, on declarations, but many of them turned up to our picket lines. So you can see, Kate Loach, a filmmaker who was there and even spoke in the megaphone. We had visual artists created pieces of artwork or little cartoons. And also we got a lot of support from poets who were coming to, share some of their poetries on the picket line. And it was during this dispute that they came together in a new collective called Poetry on the Picket Line. Then they're still running, still going to support lots of different picket lines. That dispute and that collaboration led actually to quite a, maybe a bit bureaucratic next stage, but actually quite significant, where our union at our annual general conference voted to introduce policies on oil sponsorship. And obviously it was to oppose those oil sponsorships that gave confidence and strength to all of our branches in those different museums that were sponsored by a variety of oil sponsorship to come together, but also to start approaching management about those issues. Or maybe we surveyed our members in different workplaces. We were running sort of like internal activities rather than protests. But that was quite significant and gave us a really democratic mandate to further our collaboration with BP or not BP and Art Not Oil. So I'm going to hand back over to Chris to talk to us about the British Museum, and just highlighted that, yeah, we're probably running a little bit over time, but it's fantastic. So Chris, is you next for the British Museum.
Cool. And just as a very quick kind of footnote to what Clara just said about that vote going through, and there have been subsequent kind of motions as well. But sometimes when talking about fossil fuel sponsorship, we know kind of it's symbolically important, but what practically is going on. And so in some of my investigations and research work, we once found out that BP had written to the institutions it sponsored and set up a meeting with all the heads of security and the corporate partnership managers to say, look, what are we going to do about the protest? How are we going to handle this? So they all went off to BP's office and had that chat. What was exciting is that when that motion was passed and that was publicized, we got hold of these emails from the National Portrait Gallery, so sponsored by BP and next door to the National Gallery. This email went around saying it would be good to understand if there's an affiliation to this organization within your respective establishments. We know this email came from the head of art and culture for BP. And then this is copying in the deputy director of the National Portrait Galleries. Thank you for alerting me to this. I believe that the PCS union does represent some gallery employees, and I've shared this information so that we can be aware and prepared for any potential impacts. And I just share this because it really reflects how these cultural institutions are very quickly and very readily move to the agendas and become quite partisan to the interests of these corporate sponsors and really see themselves as being there to defend the interests of BP and stick up for them, rather than wondering, well, why is it the PCS have passed this motion and why are these people coming and protesting, and should we now be subjecting them to a bit more scrutiny than we have been? So yeah, I'm just going to speak a little bit about the campaigning that emerged around the British Museum, and I'll do it sort of in a very kind of top level way, but hopefully if people have questions, we can come to them a little bit later. The bulk of BP or not BP's campaigning has been around BP's sponsorship of the British Museum, and they've been a sponsor there, or had been a sponsor there since 1996. Initially sort of through the redevelopment of the building, but the main thing they sponsored was temporary exhibitions, and the kind of big blockbuster exhibitions, and they were called the BP exhibitions. You would see BP's logo and name on the wall if you went in to view them. And one of the things we noted was that these exhibitions would often align to countries where BP had a strategic business interest. So Mexico, Australia, at the time they were trying to drill in the Great Australian Bight, and Russia. So all of these different regions. And I think it's important to say BP or not BP were a predominantly kind of white and middle class group. not exclusively so, but to a large extent. And as things evolved, particularly with a space like the British Museum, with its colonial origins, with the issues around restitution, these kind of questions of how we join the dots between different struggles became more integral to what we do. So here were just a quick rundown of 4 different techniques or creative strategies that we used to try and really embed solidarity with some of these other groups and some in some ways with workers and also with other impacted groups. So this is Gilberto Torres, who was a Colombian trade unionist who was in the process of taking BP to court over their alleged role in his abduction and torture. And so in this case, we did a scripted theatre performance, kind of like the Faustus performance at the Stage Invasions, where there was an opportunity for him to step forward and kind of bear witness and tell the account of what had happened to him. And this whole kind of performance was themed around the idea of there being a truth translator. So there's a BP figure who would spread lies and disinformation, and then Gilberto, who was telling the truth. And an important thing to mention, just related to this, is that when we would go and do these performances, we would often prepare a letter to staff within the institution as well. So this is the specific one about the performance with Gilberto that we would hand out to staff, highlighting the fact that there would be this motion that's passed by PCS, but also why we were there, why we were doing what we were doing, and clarifying that our protests were not targeting staff, and we know that the sponsorship is decided by the management and the trustees, not by frontline workers. This was another technique working with London-Mexico Solidarity. So I refer to it as invisible-ish theatre, and we collaborated with them on a few occasions, but here was around a Day of the Dead event at the British Museum, which is sponsored by BP, and upstairs BP were meeting with members of the Mexican government, and downstairs we adopted these kind of satirical kind of Day of the Dead figures and someone there dressed as the Mexican president as well. And we really did that in collaboration with them and using the kind of techniques of their activism that felt appropriate. A subsequent one, again, working with London Mexico Solidarity workers and other groups, and you can see the sunflower there that Clara was referring to earlier. We created a rebel exhibition called A History of BP in 10 Objects. So we smuggled in objects, plinths and so on, and set up our own exhibition inside the British Museum. And through different objects, we're able to tell the stories of different struggles. And again, joining the dots between the impacts of climate change, worker struggles and so on. And then just on a slightly different kind of tack, but again, joining the dots between different issues within the museum. This is a man called Rodney Kelly, who is campaigning to get the Guigal shield in the museum's collection returned. It's a shield that belongs to his direct ancestor. There's much more that could be said about that object, but the technique that we adopted here was just essentially running unofficial tours of the museum that would allow Rodney and other people to speak about the true stories related to these objects, how they ended up in the museum's collection and why they needed to be returned. And as part of that, highlighting how BP sponsorship was connected to the kind of colonial origins of the museum as well. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of some of these different techniques of how we use the creative strategies to embed solidarity. I'll hand back to Clara.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to comment on, a couple of points that were made by Chris here. The letter that the group started to handing to staff, was a joint idea, and it was a game changer in terms of collaboration. Staff really appreciate it. We've now used it again and again, different institutions. This year, I was doing an action with XR Merseyside, and we used it at the Walker Art Gallery. So, any advice to protest groups, wherever you protest, whether it's on climate or other issues, always make sure that you also have something to address the staff. Also, the sort of like relationship to empire and, race equality, was really relevant for us, and we really appreciate this sort of new approach that BP or not BP was taking. A lot of our members were migrant workers, especially at the British Museum, in the cleaning staff, who had been outsourced to a company called Carilion, which absolutely collapsed at some stage. You may remember that. And you can come back to the slide with Adaf Suyef, actually. So the staff had been, the cleaning and portering staff had been outsourced to this company called Carilion that ended up going bankrupt. Our staff were absolutely left with no support from the British Museum for 2 or 3 months. They had no ideas what their future was going to be. And when a new company was brought in by the administrators, a company called TSS, they fired and rehired every single member of staff. Some of them had been at the British Museum for over 25 years. This is at this moment that one of the trustees, Adaf Suyef, who is a writer, a British Egyptian writer, an artist, who had been on the board of trustees, decided to resign. What was really interesting is that she met the link between those different issues. She was resigning on the ground of 3 issues. And is it the next slide now? The treatment of the Carilion workers by the British Museum, but also the BP sponsorship, as well as the refusal by the British Museum to return some artifacts that had been stolen during the British Empire. So that was really powerful, and it was really helpful that she brought those issues together. Those type of action also allowed us as a union to strengthen the involvement of our Black Members Network, and some leader of the PCS Black Members Network that involve Black and Brown workers started to collaborate with BP or not BP. And I think we're moving on to the next slide and Tate, given the time. I think we're going to try to run quite quickly through those last few slides. There were collaborations in other institutions. For example, at the Tate, where BP was the sponsors, there were several protests that didn't engage with workers, but during one in particular, where protesters occupied the Tate for 24 hours, spending their time writing quotes about climate justice and social justice on the floor of the turbine hall in Tate Modern. Some of those messages refer to solidarity with workers, opposing zero-hours contracts, solidarity with the National Gallery disputes, also condemning, on the picture you can see cheap labor, dirty energy, a package deal. But the Tate was the first museum to actually drop BP as a sponsor, and I think we didn't have enough time to develop those relationships. As you can see, some of this action were impacting massively onto our members who had to clean the entire hall afterwards. Do you want to put the next slide on, Chris? And I think you just briefly tell us about National Theatre and South Bank before I conclude with some of our inspiration for creativity.
Sure. So just to say really quickly, and this will maybe come up with some of the kind of interviews that we're going to share ahead of our discussions, but the value of the kind of creative protest was that, and as we've kind of shown, it's a contact point, a starting point for conversations. And so through other groups, through BP or not BP and Culture Unstained, and also through PCS Culture Group, there was new kind of conversations that were starting with other workers, other unions, and specifically the South Bank institutions, so the South Bank Centre itself, the BFI, and in particular the National Theatre, and a group called the Art Workers Forum that also kind of formed around this time. And one of the things that was instrumental to that, again, some acknowledgement to the youth climate strike movement, created a context in which these kind of conversations came to the fore, and that workers within these institutions could say, look, we want to join these climate strikes, or starting to have those conversations, but we also have the issue of this fossil fuel sponsorship. And so it was a kind of a context for those conversations starting. And we kind of highlighted and celebrated some of these wins, but with the South Bank Centre of the National Theatre in particular, it was very much internal organising by workers, by staff, and really using the kind of wider networks of actors, performers, theatre makers to kind of leverage pressure as well. So maybe that's all I'll say about that for the time being, but like I say, the kind of impact of the creative interventions sometimes flows beyond what is visible, and it's actually these conversations that happen as a consequence of them that is where some of the impact lies as well.
And I think what's worth highlighting is that this collaboration with anti-oil sponsorship, climate justice groups, really gave us an extra confidence and impetus to use art and creativity as part of our campaigns. So in 2016, for example, the PCS Culture Group collaborated with DPAC, Disabled People Against Cuts. We joined force at Tate, and we actually copied the model of the disobedient exhibition that BP or not BP had done at the British Museum. But here we were highlighting the fact that the Paralympics and the Tate were sponsored by BP. We were highlighting the fact that there weren't many disabled artists represented at the Tate on galleries, but also the sort of like poor provision of accessibility for disabled people in that venue. So we had this Art for Rights disobedient exhibition, which displayed the work of 12 disabled artists, and the majority of people who took part were disabled people and some allies. The influence went well beyond the PCS Culture Group, and some of you may remember the long-running campaign and disputes that the cinema workers at Picture House in Ridzi, for example, they belong to the trade union Bectu. And, in their regular campaign, they were having, musics and performances, and also using those sort of creativity tactics on the picket line. This has actually got a long legacy. And in 2020, as the COVID pandemic hit the country, museum workers, you may not think about, but actually were essential workers. Some of them, like cleaning staff and security, had to go in for the whole lockdowns. But also we saw mass waves of redundancies for our shops and cafe staff, which obviously were closed. They were the lowest paid, the most precarious workers. And as they went on strike at the Tate to defend their jobs, they were using those sort of like creative tactic, creating their own banners, having workshops on the picket line. Do you want to move to the next slide, for example? They were doing performances on the pickets, and they even, created fake art. I mean, this one on the right-hand side, a mystery artwork has appeared at the level 1 toilet of the Tate Modern, anonymous inverted fountain after Marcel Duchamp. So there was a lot of humor as well that I think using creative tactic and, using our art meant that as workers, it was less difficult to face those really big challenges that, losing your jobs or being on low pay, not knowing how you're going to pay your rent was always like really dreadful and depressing. So by using art, we were actually, showing culture some love and bringing some hope into our struggles. And I think this is the last slide. So we've slightly gone over, but we've got a bit of time for questions. And I think Rebecca is gonna chair the sort of like question session. And I believe we're gonna like take all the questions at once, so we're not having to come back after every question.
Oh, thank you, Chris and Clara. What a fantastic presentation. Does anyone have a question or something that they'd like to say in response to the presentation that we've just seen? Gustavo. Hello.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. It's so important for us here in Brazil. So many questions that are in common with the ones you were dealing with. here in Brazil, we have some other problems that would make very much more difficult to have the kind of work, wonderful work that you do together, workers and protesters and everybody mixed up. And here we have this petroleum company called Petrobras, which was in the first decade of this century the most important sponsor in culture, but it's not a totally private company. So it has a history of being also like a symbol of a strong state and state company. It's half state, half private company. So it's a company which is linked to a imaginary of strong state, strong country, and left political forces have used this kind of thinking to make cultural policies using this company, half state company, to make a kind of half state sponsorship, which is hard to explain here, but it's only for you to understand that it would be very difficult for us to make this kind of movement that you did, because everybody, every artist here in Brazil is kind of, maybe one day we'll get a sponsorship from the oil company, from the main oil company in the last decade, and now from the mining company, which is also very important sponsor now, culture sponsor. And so we have this kind of difficulties. So I would like to make you a question. Which kind of the protesters, not the workers part, not Clara's part, that I understood that you were from the workers movement, okay, but the protesters, the ones that are not from the from the picket line, are they linked to any kind of NGO, or they have any kind of organization, institutionalization? Are they do they live from their activity, or they have other jobs? I would like to understand that, because this is kind of crippling for us. Artists would never engage in such in this kind of such interesting work that you do here in Brazil. And how does that work? Do they need sponsorships to live? This kind of I would like to ask you to understand. Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Gustavo, very much for your question, and also for joining from Brazil. Again, it's brilliant. Okay, so there are a couple of questions in the chat. One from M. Putman Trimmer, which is, do you have a response to the recent stage invasion of Les Miserables? And one from Catherine Heinmeier. Apologies if I'm pronouncing people's names abominably, by the way. Do you think that recent clampdowns on protest and democratic expression in the UK would have prevented many of the actions BP or not BP and PCS union conducted at cultural institutions? And those questions are there for your reference. Very good questions. Has anyone else got a question just before, like maybe 3 is quite enough actually for now? What do you want, Clara, Chris? Should we tackle the 3 and then see if there's any more? Okay, go for it.
I'll start because I'm just quite fired up by this question. So thank you. I mean, Gustavo, I guess I haven't got like the full answer to your question, but I mean, it is interesting that, the Petrobras is a state company. I mean, our museums are state museums funded by the government because we were working in national institutions. And we haven't got a national oil company here, so it's a bit difficult to relate. But I guess that it is problematic that artists have got to rely on private companies for their survival. And, you know, it's important to have campaigns that are going to demand proper funding for the art, proper public investments in the art, because it's not just good for artists and for people who love enjoying the art. It's proven that art is actually good for health. You know, it's good for society. So it's a real investment that, you know, every public institution and government should definitely invest in. In France, the country I'm from, there is a special regime for artists. So if you can, you know, prove that you've got a certain income from an artistic activity, you will then, in period of, you know, inactivity, you will get a minimum income to support you, you know, when you are rehearsing or creating, etc. And I think that's something worth exploring. I mean, some people are trying to campaign for, you know, this minimum citizen income, and, you know, that could help. But hopefully with the election of Lula, things are going to improve, fingers crossed. Quick one about Les Miserables. To be honest, I probably didn't have as much opinion about the stage invasion of the Miserables that I had about the soup on the Van Gogh flower, and, you know, the sort of actions that have happened in a number of museums by Just Stop Oil and, you know, other campaign groups that haven't yet developed relationship with workers. And I guess that those type of action, unfortunately, they do get publicity, and people talk about Just Stop Oil far more when they throw soup at national galleries than they ever had when they were blocking the roads. So I can understand where they're coming from. As museum workers, we wouldn't support the damaging of art of work, obviously. That's something that we cannot relate to. But I think the main problem with those is that it wasn't creative and it wasn't engaging workers. So I would advise Just Stop Oil to, you know, watch our session. I'll finally very briefly say about the question about clamping down on protests. I mean, it's difficult to say retrospectively what would have happened, but we did have the police on our picket lines a number of times, and not just at the National Gallery, you know, myself protesting at the Maritime Museum in Liverpool. It's a private space, and they, you know, used to call the security first, then the police. But some of you may have seen or actually been at some recent protests in banks and insurances during the Oily Money Conference, protesting against ECOP, the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, and the West Cumbria coal mine. And people invaded the foyer of those insurance companies. And when the insurance tried to get the police to remove them, the police said, no, you know, it's a social space. They're not blocking the entrance, and actually we're not going to remove them. So I think, you know, the change in law is problematic, and that's certainly something that trade unions, workers, and climate justice protesters should be working more closely on. But to be honest, we've always been repressed, you know, for centuries when we resist. So we'll continue doing it. And sorry, Chris, I've rambled and answered the question, but I'll pass on to you.
I don't think you have rambled. It was really interesting. And similarly, like, all of these questions are really rich. So on the first question about who are the people doing the protesting, I think the thing I would say is there were maybe like different layers or different categories of people, right? So there were people who maybe had a little bit more freedom. So within BP or not BP, there would be people who were like professional actors, performers, writers, also people with no artistic training. And that combination was really important to us. It was important that the actions were accessible. But those people maybe had a little bit more freedom to protest, to dissent, because of however they were funding their work, it was less of a risk. But in conjunction with that, we were also doing this kind of engagement work, which is what I sort of do with Culture Unstained now, of finding ways that we could set up events with people working within the culture sector and the arts, or spaces where there could be what we call sort of Chatham House rules, so where people could talk openly without it being communicated beyond that. And working out how can people move together so that there isn't one person having to take a risk on their own, that we're moving in solidarity, that we're making a call together. And I think a little bit like Clara said, again, that we're joining the dots, so that these kind of challenges on the sponsorship piece come in conjunction with the people campaigning against austerity and saying we need better kind of structures of funding as well. So kind of working out what are the different levels of risk that people were able to take, and what's a kind of interesting offer that that we can make so they can express their position from as safe as possible a position. Really quickly on the Les Mis action, I think it, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about it. I guess maybe just to look back to the stage invasions with BP or not BP, we used to say to the audience, if you agree with us, tear out the BP logo from your program. And people did, and we collect them outside. So there was this visual expression of solidarity. There was a connection between us and the audience. I mentioned briefly, there was one intervention after there had been several, where the actors came on stage and told security to leave us alone and let us finish the protest. And I think those relationships, if we can find ways of cultivating them, ways of making a kind of emotional connection, inviting people in through the storytelling, there are all these other possibilities that then become available for us to kind of broaden our movements. And so I guess it's not to say that protesting lame is wrong, but actually a little bit of tweaking or a little bit of shift in approach could open up these other possibilities for solidarity and alliance building, which I think is really important. And just really briefly on the clampdowns, I think the creative tactics are a great way of slipping between that, of singing to security, of these kind of things that makes us a little bit more agile and can maybe resist or, you know, push back a little bit on some of these new laws that have come in. But the thing I wrote down was just around positionality, was something someone pointed out once about our kind of perception of, oh, we can go into a museum and cause a bit of chaos and disruption and so on. But again, like I said, BP or not BP, we're a primarily white middle class group, and a lot of the out not all groups were as well. And it was sort of flagged, actually that experience of protest is not the same for everyone based on sexual orientation, gender, race, and those kind of factors. And so even when we think, oh, this is a safe way to protest and it's suddenly changed for us, actually for a lot of people, it's always been a high risk activity. And the way that police showing up to our protests are going to treat us or some of the groups we're working with would be very different as well. So I think we always needed to like keep that at the forefront of our minds as well.
Thanks, Chris. So Aparna wants to know, can you speak about your engagement with multi-oil corporation giants from the global south, such as Adani? Has this posed different challenges to those you faced earlier, or how has this?
I think there is a last question as well from Henry. So if we take Henry's as well and then stop question.
Oh, yeah. So how do you respond? This is Henry's. How do you respond to the increasing right-wing media narrative that labels all disruptive protest in the same group as an eco-mob or eco-zealots?
I'll go quite briefly because I probably haven't got as much to say on those two, but thanks for your good question. I think the Adani sponsorship at the Science Museum is, you know, absolutely horrendous. But this is an institution that was sponsored by BP and then by Equinor, which is the Norwegian state oil company. And, you know, more recently, Adani is, you know, it's almost the last museum that we haven't managed to move. And personally, I haven't been involved that much at the campaign at the Science Museum. I'm based in Liverpool, and because I haven't got my union role, I lost my job, so I've moved on to a different union. I am not as often in London, so I don't get as much opportunity to get involved at the moment. A lot of different groups have taken on this battle, you know, from Fridays for Future to, you know, different sort of XR groups, but other groups as well. So it is like a much more diverse type of groups are allying against the Science Museum. I would just highlight that my union PCS was never strong at the Science Museum. We only had a handful of members. The main union is Prospect, which I have to say has got, you know, sort of like problematic views and policies when it comes to fossil fuel. So whether or not that is playing a role, but yeah, I wouldn't be able to comment much more. In terms of the sort of like right-wing narrative, I mean, it's quite a wide question, really, Henry. It is worrying to see that more and more sort of like racist and fascist in the political spectrum are now, you know, intervening on the issue of climate change. Whether it is to abuse protesters or it's to criticize the 15-minute cities, I think the threat of sort of eco-fascism is, you know, clearly problematic. And then you've got all the narratives around migrations that we know are, you know, going to continue to increase because of the impact of the climate crisis. So it is an area where we need to like put our intentions, and yeah, certainly more alliances and collaborations of groups are possible there. I'll just pass on to Chris if you've got a couple of comments.
Sure. So within Culture Unstained, we've sort of been quite active on working on the Adani sponsorship at the Science Museum, and yeah, this kind of coalition that Clara mentions, which is the Fossil Free Science Museum Coalition. I think the two main things that have come up for us is the importance of being led or working as far as possible with communities on the ground. So one of the interventions that we did was taking an ad van to the Science Museum that was showing films that came from communities in India, Indonesia, and Australia. So the voices of the indigenous communities were coming directly to the door in that way. And it doesn't sound quite right to say it presents an opportunity, but in some way, Adani is not a company that's so known. And one of the challenges we've had with that campaign is not getting media coverage in the same way that BP or Shell does, because there's less of that familiarity and I would say maybe some racial bias within the media as well that means that's the case. But I then think the responsibility for us as activists in the UK and the global north is to get Adani onto the news agenda and for people to know what the company is involved in. And like really quickly to say, we know a lot of people might know Adani is involved in coal extraction, coal power stations, also involved in weapons and defense manufacture, and has a collaboration with the Israeli weapons company Elbit as well. So just, again, there's a lot under the radar there. And yeah, really quickly on the sort of right-wing media narratives, I think that's why it's great for us to be a little bit playful about how we frame and present ourselves, and also who it is that we collaborate and work with, so that we're not always the usual suspects. We could be in the form of a choir, a theatre group, a collaboration between unexpected groups coming together in a different way, so that we're always kind of changing the story to kind of get around to that narrative. And I would say sometimes the Daily Mail has written very good, very balanced articles that sometimes someone has gone through and used find and replace to put the word eco-zealot in as well. So sometimes we can kind of hack and disrupt those spaces. Still shouldn't read the Daily Mail or share it, but sometimes the kind of inventiveness, the creativity can be a way that we still get our message through, I think. I've probably waffled as well. I'm sorry.
Very, very astute responses. So let's power on. Clara, do you want to talk about what's going to happen in the next bit? I don't know why I'm handing over to you rather than Chris, but it's because we were talking about the videos.
Yeah, we're just going to have smaller spaces where you can discuss what you have heard. And Chris, if you can just put the questions first on the presentation. So we're going to watch 2 short interviews with a worker from the British Museum, or former worker from the British Museum, Jasmine, and with a former worker at the National Theatre, Catherine. And then we're going to split you into little groups of 4 or 5. So you've got a bit of space for yourself that's maybe less intimidating to reflect about what you've just heard. And we've got questions for you just to help you, with your reflection. How was the creativity art used as part of this campaign? What alliances and collaboration existed between workers and external groups? What worked to build those alliances? What were the challenges? And any lessons that can be taken forward in the present, in particular in current climate justice campaigns. We will post the questions again, don't worry, so they won't disappear. But yeah, we're just going to watch those couple of interviews now before we break out.
My name's Jasmine Lothar, and I used to work at the British Museum. While I was at the museum, I was the PCS branch secretary, and the first actual protest that I saw was when we had a Shakespeare exhibition in the reading room, I think, and it was either Art Not Oil or BP Not BP, I think BP Not BP, who came to do a performance inside the exhibition, and that was the first ever time that I actually heard of this protest group. And funny enough that, we work at the museum, but we weren't aware that we were sponsored by BP. Although their logos were on the, exhibition spaces, I never actually thought about that as an issue, because you just don't. You go to work, you do your job, and you come home. So for me, seeing that protest really sort of sparked a sort of like, oh, hang on, what's going on here? Every time there's a protest, you would have people, discussing, in the canteen at break time, oh, did you see this and that, and what do you think about this? So like I said, it sparked a lot of debate. There were some people who have an opposite view, which is absolutely fine, but it's good to at least be talking about it, because then it makes people aware of what's going on. And then I'd say another thing that really made members talk about this was climate change and how we see the environment around us changing every year. The museum, working in the museum is absolutely terrible when it's hot outside and when it's cold outside. So I'm not talking about like normal temperatures, it's extreme temperature. It's a tough one. I mean, there are challenges just because of the nature of our jobs. So many of our members would work in security or visitor services, and then our job is to keep the collection safe and maintain the security of the building. So some people found like a conflict almost between doing their job, and although they agreed with the action that the protest groups would take, that there were concerns about security issues, especially because the government have changed the laws around protests. We decided to run through the culture group another survey, because just to follow up on the first one that was done quite a while ago, and overwhelmingly the results from that just said that the museum staff plus staff from other museums didn't agree with having BP as a sponsor, and other oil companies are sponsors of our wider culture group. So that's really where we knew that it was what members wanted, that we would be not directly involved with the action that the groups take, but definitely supportive of them and supportive of what they're trying to. I mean, definitely, the protest groups have always been supportive of our union branch, and we have had links with them through the culture group where we've sort of said, we've got these issues going on. Like when we were on strike recently, some of the members did come down to our picket line, and although the branch expressed that they didn't want any sort of performances to happen there at the picket line, there were people there, and we did speak to them, and they were very sweet. They brought us muffins and cups of tea. So there was a lot of there's a good relationship between the staff and the protest groups. They never did anything they understand the nature of our job, and they never did anything to jeopardize what we do. And they were fully understanding, and they were very supportive in that way. And then definitely if there were struggles going on, they were willing to do something to sort of highlight our cause to the press and stuff. It's nice to see those familiar faces around, so because I've been there for 17 years, and I think they've pretty much been protesting for that long, I guess, pretty much, right? So yeah, it's always nice to have support for whatever you're doing. So yeah.
So my name's Catherine. I used to belong to Beck2 when I worked a series of front of house jobs in different theatres in London. at the time, the National Theatre was sponsored by Shell. So a really big problem, and this is like across different institutions that I've worked for throughout my adult life, really, is that a lot of them are propped up by the labour of staff on insecure contracts. And when I first started doing this kind of work, it was called 0-hour contracts. What I was witnessing was common to all the institutions I worked in, was staff being forced to come in when they were sick because they weren't paid sick pay, they couldn't afford to lose the shifts. Staff worrying about not being able to pay their rent, feed themselves, having to commute extremely long distances for shifts that often lasted about 4.5 hours. I guess I'd sort of been interested in connecting what I was experiencing in the workplace to kind of wider political issues. It was something that I felt was connected, but I think I didn't quite understand it at the time. And I connected with a group called the Art Workers Forum, AWF, which is like a loose network of trade unionists from different cultural and arts institutions, kind of aiming to do just that, to connect sort of industrial disputes, workplace issues with kind of broader political struggle. So things like climate, for example, or Palestine solidarity. I came across Culture Unstained, BP or not BP, and we met properly, I think, at the first climate strike. So myself and a very small group of colleagues managed to organise a climate strike, a sort of walkout of the theatre. So that was kind of how the kind of collaboration started, and then from there we tried to collaborate as much as possible and show each other solidarity for the different kind of actions we were organising. A lot of these arts institutions work quite hard to kind of appropriate the language of climate justice, which that's where the Shell sponsorship came in. It was actually quite useful because that was something really concrete that we could demand from them. Because the language they used previously was about, and it's the same for a lot of arts institutions, is by focusing on their own carbon footprint. Understood environmentalism as something that happens without workers, something that happens at a managerial level, and is something very much based on the kind of consumption choices, essentially. The next obstacle is if you're speaking to people who are really trying to get by, and you're talking to them about climate, that was trying to make the leap from their workplace conditions, their working conditions, to climate. The front of house team was sacked with the pandemic, so I think it was 400 casuals were let go. Some people were rehired, and the kind of firing and rehiring process was really suspect. We held this big protest at the National Theatre, and members of BP or not BP or Culture Unstained turned up and spoke, and so I think that was like one of the sort of best examples of that kind of solidarity. And so I feel I was very moved by it, but I think I kind of learned a lot from that. But I gave this speech outside the National Theatre about exactly why we should be connecting working conditions with climate, which was kind of exemplified by the pandemic, which is that when there's a particular crisis, a pandemic or weather event, the insecure staff are the first people to suffer, they're the first people to lose their jobs. I don't know really what the current situation is like now, but the impression I get from colleagues who are there is that the atmosphere is very different. It's a lot more corporate. There was a big outsourcing of kind of catering facilities. I imagine that would be the plan for most of the theatre, is to kind of outsource all their kind of front of house activities. And a lot of ushers and staff in theatres feel quite keenly, because actually quite a lot of us are artists in our own right. Most people there were actors and felt this kind of affiliation with the theatre. And I think when they lost their jobs and it was shown to them how kind of disposable they were, they felt that very, very keenly. So I think having a creative element to these protests and a kind of a celebration of of the theatre was really important for a lot of my colleagues, because I think that kind of creative side of their identities had kind of been erased by those roles. Like, it kind of ignores the fact that you actually are artists in your own right.
So as we explained, we're going to go into breakouts. I have posted the questions that, are there to sort of inspire you. Obviously, feel free to discuss any reflection you had on what you've just heard, but maybe, do try to reflect in particular about what lessons can be taken forward in the present, especially when it comes to current campaigns and climate justice campaigns. So is there any brave volunteer that want to kick us?
We were talking a little bit about kind of the idea of performative action, and then what that then means in a performative space. So it was really interesting, just the idea of like a company or an organization doing that kind of performative sustainability or performative activism, and then just what that means when you're kind of then faced with a literal performance or a literal performance protest. That was a point that was made. It was really interesting. And then we were talking about the idea of making sure that everybody understands who the common kind of we use a villain or enemy, maybe that's a bit pejorative, but that all the workers and everybody who's on the protest or understands for the cause who we're actually protesting against, in terms of the organization, the sponsors and levels of that. So just about bringing people along on that journey. And then really briefly, I was just commenting on the National Theatre Shell sponsorship. It used to sponsor one of the big youth theatre festivals that happened at the National Theatre, and I was just reflecting on the idea that I think the impact then that has on participants or community groups. So because that was sponsored the youth theatre and it was called like Shell Connections, all of the young people, schools, educators and youth theatres who were part of that were then like had this label on them, like completely, like they didn't work for the theatre, but they still had that kind of forced onto them, I suppose. So just think about the impact on participants and how the young people just probably wouldn't stand for that now if it was still called that today. So.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steph. Anybody wants to come in and share some of their thoughts and discussions? Dave, you've unmuted yourself. Okay, go on. And then I think Cecily.
I'm struggling a bit because I'm on a mobile phone because my computer wouldn't communicate for some reason. We had a chat about, I work for Banner Theatre, so we talked about really what was really inspiring was the kind of making links with PCS and the workers in the museums. That's I think is really important, and it opened up for me the capacity to work together and collaborate on stuff, because people like in Banner we've got our own particular network audience, but also there is that whole area of doing street theatre or that kind of stuff, and linking that up is really, really important, and finding a way of a lot of area. We had a discussion about how do you get in touch with areas which are not unionized, and I think there's a lot of problems around that. So finding your way in to a union, and some unions are not that progressive. We've been banned over our lifetime by 3 different unions, so it's also but I think working with unions is a good way to kind of bring people on your side, and I was really impressed with that in the bits that I could hear on this crazy mobile phone. I probably missed a load out, but that was what we talked about a bit.
Thanks so much, Dave. Cecily, did you want to go next?
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree with what Dave just said. There are so many opportunities, and you've just highlighted so many of them of how to get more people involved and connected. And there are so many connections between all of us. against the rich oppressors, whatever. So I think that the challenge that I would have is finding a song, but then I thought, well, it doesn't have to be piece. It could be a dance, it could be using drums, whatever. So it's whatever the group is good at, whoever comes together to fight, you use the skills you have and make something wonderful.
Thanks, Cecily. Anybody else would like to share their thoughts? Clara and Gustavio.
Thank you so much, Clara and Chris and Rebecca. It was really amazing for us, and what we were trying to say the moment that our connection failed is for us, for example, the challenge of this sponsorship by Shell is something so strong, and also Petrobras here in Brazil, that, for example, many projects idealized, conceived by left-wing movements and workers, cultural workers, had been sponsored by Shell and Petrobras, for example. So they try to name wash, wash their names and all this action, the terrible action of oil in our planet, sponsoring projects that have social development, approach and objectives and goals, and in poor places, for example, here in Rio, something very strong in the favelas, and then our oil company sponsoring this kind of projects of social development. So it's very difficult for us. All this debate is amazing to see your work, and it's very inspiring for us also because artists here have a lot of difficulty of understanding the importance of struggle against this. So, for example, a movement that we are part, a social movement of artists, we have a prize from Shell. Award, exactly, award. So we made a performance once, exactly showing that we cannot accept this anymore. What is this award for theater and performance from this oil company?
It was very funny because our movement that years we were nominee for one of the awards, because every year they give those prizes, those awards to best actor, best director in Rio, in São Paulo, best play,
and also something different, a social initiative, a political initiative.
We were nominees that year. They didn't know exactly what we were doing. So at that evening, it was very funny because we are not there, because we were making an internship in Paris, in France. But we helped to write the manifest, and our friends there, they were all dressed up in carnival fashion,
and trying to say no, oil, no, please.
And they started to drink Shell drinks
on stage. They could,
and then they, went to the stage up and they said, "Okay, what are you doing, Shell? If you are sponsoring a award, so you are the company of you are the sponsor of theater, but you are not sponsoring any play or any theater building, only this tiny award here."
But what I think is important also is the connection with the artist. We had to show it also to our friends, to the audience that was formed by artists that were there clapping and saying,
applauding Shell.
applauding. So I think it's what Dave just said, how it is important, this connection with the unions. We don't have this here. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
So the connection with the workers, as you are doing so brilliantly, is very difficult here for us, the artists and workers, and how we can unite this struggle is the same problem.
Yeah, we were not
So-
able to show like you did that austerity is the same thing
Yeah,
as
it's for everybody.
yeah, austerity and the ecological problem
Yeah.
are the same thing.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I guess that a lot of groups I've worked with, they always say, oh, it's so difficult to engage with the unions. And it is. I think in our situation, the fact that I was a trade union rep and leader, and then, spread it to collaboration, it didn't come from like outside groups approaching us, it came from the inside, was really important. I've actually got a contact for a trade unionist in Brazil from the oil industry, who recently participated to a conference in Amsterdam on global climate jobs. So, I'm not saying that would resolve everything, but it's where sort of like exploring those, connections that you may have. Well, it's been a long session, 2 hours on a Thursday night. We're really grateful for everybody who stayed with us. And yeah, maybe I'll hand back over to Rebecca or Chris to sort of close the session and thank everybody. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you just want to echo what Clara said. I
Yeah.
think the reflection I was just having at the end that I've sometimes wondered about, and is something we're thinking about, is yes, the solidarity here, but then also like the international solidarity. So with this, the different contexts, like what can we do from our UK context to support, strengthen if the situation is different? This is something we're exploring with like Norway at the moment. That Equinor is everywhere, but it's like, actually, can we share the spotlight? Can we support you? And so I think that piece is quite exciting. But
Yeah,
back to you, Rebecca.
Yeah. I agree. And those international connections, it's one of the things that I'm finding very rewarding about running this project, even in a very small way, to kind of get these conversations repeatedly going against different examples, but across the oceans, to see how similar our struggles often are, but then also how our specific contexts are different, and it's very useful to learn from one another. So I think that's something I think I'll keep taking forward from this. And also what you were saying, Clara, about like being active within your trade union, that's certainly something I kind of would have done it anyway, being active in my trade union, but it's something that's absolutely made work possible for me in a similar way. So yeah, I suppose I think everybody here probably is in a union if it's relevant for them to be in one, but I think that's like, it's kind of a no-brainer as well. And I always find as well, trades councils and trade unions are very willing to like hear about creative ideas, often have bits and pieces of money, bits and pieces of different kinds of support that they're willing to give. It's more about having people thinking about those ideas that are also in roles like rep roles or a member of a committee or something. I think it's like making that connection. I think even within our trade unions is really important. Anyway, thank you so much to everybody that's come along. Really, really appreciate it. And especially thank you to Clara and Chris. Amazing presentation from you, and such a lot of learning that we've done. All right. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you. Take good care.